By 1990, on January 20, the Soviet troops entered Azerbaijan with great violence, killed over 130 people. That was the last nail in the coffin of the Soviet. It was over. What Ilham Aliyev has done, he delivered on his father's promise. He delivered to all of us. He delivered the return of our people. He delivered my dream of being able to go back to my father's place in Glaverbel. Azerbaijan has prospered. The poverty is down from 49 to 5%. The stewardship you mentioned, in the most difficult and complicated part of the world.
What would either an ally or a foreign adversary have to do in order to gain the president's respect?
Respect Azerbaijan's sovereignty and independent decision-making, and treat us as equal.
Your Excellency, welcome to the new forum. Thank you very much for being here.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Charlie. Thank you for inviting me.
So you grew up in Baku in the 70s and 80s. What sort of a region, what sort of a country was that?
You know, at that time, Azerbaijan was a part of the Soviet Union. We restored our independence in 1991, but before that, we were part of the Soviet Union like 14 other republics. Azerbaijan is very unique in general, but Baku is particularly unique. It was one of the most cosmopolitan cities in the entire former Soviet Union. It was a very large city, but I think it was number 4 by size, if I'm not mistaken, maybe 4 or 5. One of the big designations of the big city in the former Soviet Union was that you would have a subway system, metro, which Baku had and still has, and it's very beautiful.
People call it the Paris of the East.
And they're right. Although I would say it's a Paris in between East and West, because it's not fully East, it's not fully West.
The intersection of cultures.
And I think that's what's the most important part of Azerbaijani culture, and specifically of Baku. Baku, for instance, was a very important place in terms of developing the Soviet tradition of jazz. Azerbaijan is very famous for what we call ethno-jazz, and that's a combination of Azerbaijani music with jazz tradition. So one of the most famous musicians in the former Soviet Union was Vagif Mustafazadeh, who was a brilliant, talented jazzman, and he was very well known around the world, by the way, at the time. Unfortunately, he died on a stage. You can imagine.
That's a good way to go, isn't it?
Dramatic. He was too young.
He died doing what he loved, though,
yes,
right?
Yes, in a way that was very symbolic.
Yes.
And his daughter now is a very famous musician as well, Aziza Mustafazadeh. So that by itself, I'm just bringing that example to show how the different cultures interlaid and intertwined in Azerbaijan. It was very, very cosmopolitan and very international, very strong Jewish presence, very strong presence from the Russians, from Ukraine, from all other people.
How did that Russian influence as a member of the Soviet Union, how did that manifest itself on people's day-to-day lives?
Well, before the Soviet Union, of course, there was the Russian Empire. The history of this place is very interesting. In general, if we go further, you would see we could talk about this, all kinds of different influences. And in the intermediate period, there was the Republic of Azerbaijan established, the Azerbaijan Democratic Republic in 1918, the first ever republic, with predominantly Muslim population.
And that existed until, it was quite brief, until 1920, when the Russians then invaded again.
Until 1920, exactly 23 months, date to a date. It's from 28th of May in 1918 to 28th of April 2020. But it was a unique state, we could talk about this, in a sense that it was the first ever republic, once again, with predominantly Muslim population. And that's a very important statement of aspiration of Azerbaijani people. It was a very intellectually established state. So, for instance, the first university in the Caucasus was established in Baku during the Azerbaijan Democratic Republic. It was a Baku State University. It still stands as a very proud.
And this is where you went to university?
I went there for 2 years, yes.
Yes.
Yeah, and then I transferred to Moscow State.
Moscow.
courtesy of a bigger, bigger country. And also, they gave equal rights to all citizens, regardless of their race, religion, which is important, ethnicity, so everybody was represented, and perhaps most importantly, gender. That is ahead of the United States of America.
That's surprisingly progressive. People often don't think, erroneously so, people often don't think of countries in that part of the world as being as progressive, especially if someone's looking through a Western-centric lens. You don't think that a country like Azerbaijan actually led in so many of these areas of democracy, equality, that sort of thing.
It's an interesting observation that you make. I think the underlying principle is that if we are human beings and we're equal, then we're all equal. There is no equal but. And I think once you establish a new state, that is a stated aspiration. Of course, it wasn't perfect. I mean, we could talk a lot about shortcomings and mistakes and inability to deliver on certain hopes. But the fact that you know that this is what you want to achieve, this is your stated goal, that we all in Azerbaijan were equal. And that's underlying most important premise of the Azerbaijani statehood. And it's probably based partly on geography, partly on our history, but because the mix of cultures is so important, mix of influences is so important, that for us it becomes a paramount matter of identity, that everybody is equal. What you said is also very interesting. I think that in some things, of course, Western nations are more progressive than others. In some things, some non-Western nations are more progressive than others. If you look only from one lens, you always see one thing which is very progressive, and then you don't see the other things. But you think, look, this doesn't look right to me. Yeah, it may not look right to you, but it actually might be acceptable to the people on the ground. Throughout my years in the United States, and they've been long years, it's very progressive, very open society. But there are also things which I wouldn't, both to the history of the United States and other things, you would never think are progressive enough. I would never imagine my country having that kind of rules or laws or even traditions. But that's how the United States has built its country, so similar to us. And then we respect and understand but cultures are, I would say, they're not superior, inferior culture, but they're different. People are different. Why should we escape that obvious observation?
I think that perspective is one that would be incredibly valuable for more people to take to heart and try and understand different people's cultures. I'd like to come back to your early years in your university. So you studied in Azerbaijan, you then studied in Russia, and you then studied in America. First it was, I believe, geography and political geography.
Yes.
Why was that an important degree topic for you? That's obviously geography has been incredibly important in understanding the region. Why did you choose that?
You asked earlier about the influence of the Soviet Union. There are many influences, of course. Some of them were very negative. It was a totalitarian state which was very closed in, and it was politically very repressive. So there was no freedom of expression. There was no, you couldn't travel anywhere. Just think about this. Going out of the country, you had to have a visa, not visa from a receiving country, but a visa from...
Just to leave,
To leave.
Yeah.
It was difficult. There was a great scarcity of things. People forget all the lines in 1980s. 300, 400, 500 people waiting for bread, for butter, for things like that. And then there was a coupon system when you get only like half kilo of butter and 1 kilo of meat per month per family. So trust me, it was not a very...
I can imagine. That's another thing that I think people nowadays aren't used to. Is just the maybe derived from bureaucracy, but various limitations on resources, one could even call them hardships, that part of the world experienced in the 20th century.
And many people in the region forget that. And that's a good thing, by the way. I want people to forget
Do you
this.
think people take for granted, though?
Yeah, but it's people get used to good things, which is good.
Okay.
Because if you don't, you got to remember that those things happened, but you should also never dwell too much on what happened, because it becomes a baggage. It pulls you down.
Yes.
It kind of locks you into something which you don't want. Negativity. It happened. We lived through this. It was good for weight management. There wasn't much to but today it's different. I don't want to say everything is good, everything is prosperous, but there's freedom. You could travel, you could buy things if you have enough resources and things like that. But also Soviet Union did bring certain industrialization into the region, helped to establish the industrial base. Soviet Union did provide certain investment into education, and being within a bigger country, let's say, although it was not fully a country, it was,
Bigger ecosystem,
it was
right?
basically, it actually was a bigger union.
Yeah.
Union is a very appropriate word for that, for the Soviet.
Did you feel kinship to the Soviet governance?
Not to the governance, no. But to the people, yes.
Okay.
We still do. We don't see someone from, let's say, Ukraine, or someone from Georgia, or someone from Central Asia as someone alien to me. We lived together for many years. We have a shared experience. I don't think that should be rejected. Some people think, that should be rejected. I don't think so. That what happened. It was not a willing or voluntary union. Let's put it for obvious reasons.
Yeah.
we didn't choose to be part of the Soviet Union. But once it happened, but in imperial history, it's everywhere. I don't think people choose to be a part of someone's empire. Empire chooses. But at the same time, you take the best of what it was there, and that's education, cultural exchanges, and getting to know those people. There was a feeling at some point, I think, at least in the mid-life of the Soviet Union, people felt Soviet. Why not?
Did you feel that way growing up?
A little bit when I was a kid. There was a lot of propaganda. You go to, young pioneers with a red tie and, some all this. But grandfather Lenin, all this, all the things. But very soon, you realize that it's not what people say it is. You see the differences. You see the duplicity. You see that what people tell you, what the government tells you, it's not true. There's a great phrase in George Orwell's 1984, some people are more equal than others.
Yes.
And that was the best description of what the Soviet Union was. I can tell you what made it. But I told you what were good things, for instance, education-wise and all this. And also, for instance, you have influences on other things. The language, for instance, starts both, by the way, Russian and also English language and all this. When you have a bigger market, let's say, for ideas, it's always good. For science development, for instance. Soviet Union did put some emphasis on science, fundamental sciences development, and theoretical sciences, which is important too. But I'll give you one example. In 1988, when the conflict between Armenia and Azerbaijan began, there was a lot of people coming in the streets, students protesting. I was one of them. But at that point, most people were protesting against injustice, selective injustice.
What was the injustice?
Azerbaijanis felt that what was being done to Azerbaijan versus Armenia was not fair.
I would like to thank the English Speaking Union and the team at Dartmouth House for hosting us here for this interview. The ESU is an international organization based in the UK that promotes public speaking, communication, and cross-cultural understanding amongst young people globally. They host a variety of programs and events aimed at furthering these skills, such as public speaking competitions, school workshops, and foreign exchange programs. The English Speaking Union was formed in the belief that more effective communication between nations would lead to improved global understanding. This belief still stands strong today. As communities become ever more multicultural and societies more divided, there has never been a greater need to understand different perspectives and opinions. How have public speaking and communication been important in your personal and professional life?
This is a good question for a diplomat. I tell you why. Diplomats generally have two personas. One formal person, technical persona when you actually manage the embassy and all, and then the one which is external when you talk to people and all. When I became a diplomat in 1998, not ambassador, I was working under the leadership of Ambassador Hafiz Pashayev in Washington, and I was a junior diplomat. Many people didn't know what Azerbaijan was. Azerbaijan was independent for like 7 years. So very often you're the person who speaks for the first time for the audience on Azerbaijan. So it's very important how you deliver your messages, what you say to people, and what they hear from you. And for a diplomat, you do not speak for yourself. You speak for your people of your nation, for your country. So I think public speaking is of fundamental importance, both in terms how you speak, but probably much more important what you say, what the message you deliver.
In what ways can strong public speaking skills benefit young people's life prospects?
I'll give you one very simple example. When I was working in Baku, I had a class. I taught a class, seminar on conflict resolution by the way, English language college in Baku. It's very interesting. Young kids, enormously talented. And I knew they were very talented because I saw the writing. But I always tell them, if you don't speak up in the class, I don't know how smart you are. Writing is good, fine. I can, but mentally we all take the impression from person who speaks. I think it's fundamentally important that people speak up, that they deliver their message, that they're not shy, that they're able to do. And of course, some things, sometimes it's not easy. I mean, look, I spoke a couple of places and then suddenly realized that because of my accent, half of the people don't understand what I'm saying. But that happens. But I think it's fundamentally important that if you wanna demonstrate that you know something, if you wanna present yourself, you need to be able to speak it up.
And for those that might be a bit younger or not as familiar with the region, we hear a lot about the Armenian Azerbaijani relations not being what I think many people would hope they would be. How can we understand that? What's the history behind that? How should we view that situation?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. Let me go back for a moment to this, to what happened in 1988. So when, for instance, the ethnic issue arose and Azerbaijanis began the expulsion of Azerbaijanis, another wave of Azerbaijani expulsion began from Armenia. The refugees showed up. Some of them hurt, some of them injured during the pogroms in Armenia. What happened was that the reaction of the Soviet leadership was not sufficient. The Soviet leadership did not, under Gorbachev, didn't do much. So people were offended. They felt that, look, why is not the Soviet leadership taking, matters and all that? Why doesn't stop the violence and all this? So at that time, the protests were mostly not decisively anti-Soviet. They were anti-Gorbachev maybe, but people would come up and they would still believe that, look, I mean, if we protest enough, if we explain our point, the Soviets, maybe Kremlin would understand it. Maybe the communists.
It was aiming to get them on side, rather than saying you're doing the wrong thing, we don't agree with you, what have you. Right?
And the problem began that the Soviet leadership responded with violence. I was there in Baku in 1988 even, on the 5th of December, after weeks of protests by students. The Soviet government used force to dispel about 500,000 young Azerbaijanis. Quite brutal force. Then similar force was used in Georgia in 1989, when a number of people, including women, were killed by Soviet troops. And I don't want to necessarily say Russian, because there was not just Russia, it was the Soviet. I think we saw that equal application of violence against the Russian people when they protested, in 1991, for instance, in Moscow. And by 1990, on January 20, I think was a turning point for Azerbaijan. Because at that day, the Soviet troops entered Azerbaijan with great violence, killed over 130 people, plus minus. Some of them are still missing, injured hundreds. And then when you see Baku, a quaint southern city, very Mediterranean, on the seaside, very southern, not necessarily a resort city, but as close to a resort city you could get. I mean, people come to Baku to feel the sun, to eat good southern food. It's a pleasant place to. And in this quaint city, you suddenly see tanks, people shooting at bystanders, killing the emergency doctors in emergency vehicles. And you suddenly understand that's not your country. That is when I understood I am not a citizen of the Soviet Union. They see me as an enemy. There is no more union. What kind of union is this if people come out with the tanks and shoot at you? And I think that day, which was a year and perhaps and a half before the dissolution, almost 2 years before the dissolution of the Soviet Union, that was the last nail in the coffin of the Soviet. It was over. Because I don't know if anybody in Azerbaijan would ever, actually after that, see themselves as a part of the union.
They probably felt incredibly betrayed by that.
Betrayed, and decision was basically made for them. Decision was made for me as well. And it was ironic because at the time there was a discussion of a new union treaty, possibly turning Soviet Union into confederation. People forget that because it's completely irrelevant now. But it's an interesting. But there was actually a discussion about this. So people were talking: should we leave? Should we stay? It was an open question. Some countries insisted like we should stay, we should leave.
That's something a lot of people forget.
Yeah, and suddenly the military leadership says, "Yeah, you leave because we're going to kill you." I mean, that's that. And so I think that's a sad part of it. And Azerbaijan has always had this independence streak, because in 1989, Azerbaijan was among, there were Baltic republics and Azerbaijan, which adopted the Declaration of Sovereignty. It didn't mean the independence, but there was getting as close as possible. And at that time, our veteran leader, who was, by the way, in the Soviet Union, a leader of Soviet Azerbaijan, and then a Politburo member, the highest ranking Azerbaijani ever in the history of the recent history of the Soviet Union. There was Narimanov in the beginning, but then Heydar Aliyev, he spoke up against that. And that was an important point, because when a Politburo member, the highest ranking Azerbaijani alive, gets out in Moscow, and I was there. I was actually, as a student, I was present at his press conference.
Wow.
It was a historic turning point when he comes out and says, we can't take that anymore. This is our people have faced an enormous betrayal. Exactly the word you said, betrayal. He said that there. And since then, I think both the independence of Azerbaijan has become de facto real and irreversible, and the collapse of the Soviet Union as well. So, which brings me back to two things. One is that you said geography.
Yes.
I think in our part of the world, studying geography is very important. Azerbaijan today is the only country which borders both Russia and Iran. We could talk about this.
Yeah.
But you can't understand the region without geography. And the other question is, of course, the conflict, which lasted for 3 decades. It's a long story, but put it short, geography matters as well. If you go back to the formation of the Soviet republics, none of them is almost none of them. It's homogeneous. No country is homogeneous. It's very difficult.
Especially a country as big as that. You have the Caucasian nations. You have the northern Russia is more similar to the Nordic regions. You have Eastern Russia, which people are very closely aligned with. I think there are Han Chinese people in Eastern Russia. So
Burats, like Mongols, for instance, with Buddhist background, the people with a Muslim background. I mean, there are a lot of difference. But if you look, for instance, at Azerbaijan and Georgia, we're also very diverse countries. One country which still is 99.9%, I think, 99.5%, I don't know, homogeneous is Armenia, which is an outlier in our part of the world, because that's unusual, let's put it that way. So when the Soviet Union was weakening, what happened is we had these autonomous regions within the republics. All of us had more or less. Georgia had, I think, three. I think it's Abkhazia, Ossetia, and Adjaria. Russia has many of them. Ukraine had Crimea. Many of them.
Yes.
Many republics had many. I mean, Uzbekistan has Karakal, Pakistan. And then we had the region which was called Nagorno-Karabakh, and the very translation of it was the mountains. Nagorno means mountains, Karabakh. And it was 75% Armenian populated. That's true. But what people forget, that the reason it was populated, because the Soviet approach was specifically to create an ethnic enclave. So the borders were done specifically to provide for majority. Because what happens is you create a majority, almost artificial, because if you take a bigger region, Karabakh, the Armenians are a very small minority.
Yes.
But you specifically create a small administrative area to provide certain services, such as language. I mean, so for instance, if you teach in an Armenian language, it makes sense to have this small. The problem with it was a Soviet idea of nationalities. But in reality, what it created, and we've seen it down the road, that experiment created, unfortunately, what I would call an ethnic resonance. It actually became a version of a ghetto in a way, because it basically kind of forced people into this ethnic identity and all this. So Armenians demanded that that part becomes part of Armenia, which is, by the way, in complete violation of international law. And they acted further down militarily to occupy that region, plus 7 adjacent regions of Azerbaijan. As a result, initially with Russian help, but then by themselves. And so by 1994, after the Soviet Union, about 20% of Azerbaijan territory was occupied. Azerbaijani internationally recognized. I'm not talking about my grandmother's dream territory. It's not what she thinks should be close to Azerbaijan.
Yes.
It's I mean, this is international. The territory we entered the UN with. The territory of the United Kingdom recognizes Azerbaijan. And about 1 million people were expelled. And that lasted for 30 years.
Do you think that, is there an argument to be made that the Soviets created that, I guess, cultural dissonance, or the collection of, as you mentioned, around 70% Armenian and around 30% Azerbaijani in Nagorno-Karabakh as a kill switch, just in case the Soviet Union broke up? It was insurance. They knew that there would be tension. They knew there would be that there'd be angst, and it would create a big problem. And so in order to keep the cohesion of the region, they produced this circumstance?
That's a great question. I'll tell you why. Certainly that's a time bomb. And not just for Azerbaijan. I mean, this pattern of ethnic separatism has been replicated throughout the former Soviet Union. That's not unusual. In the part of the world, it's actually quite established pattern. A conspiracy theorist in me, coming from our region, we all like conspiracy theories, would follow this idea. And it's a generally widely accepted, yes, that Stalin thought about this to create these things. By the way, there was a very interesting caveat of this. very often Armenians say Stalin gave Nagorno-Karabakh to Azerbaijan, which is absolutely not true. The actual text stays in Azerbaijan. It's actually just he didn't change anything.
Right.
That's important to understand that has always been part of Azerbaijan. And by the way, the people of in Karabakh, including Armenians, in 1923, they voted. 1921, they voted to remain within Azerbaijan because they felt as part of the connection to Baku and money, and Baku because it was economy, and Baku was a cosmopolitan center. So there is a very high chance that what you say is true, that diversion, that there was a deliberate effort to lay a time bomb. I also, as a geography major in both Baku and Moscow, I would say there was also a very high chance that at the time, don't forget the early 1900s, 1920s, were a time of heightened ethnic awareness, when the identity moved from imperial identities, from religious identities, into the realm of ethnicity. So it is also very possible that Soviets generally believe that this is the way to deal with the ethnic issues. It's the way to address the needs of ethnic populations. So, you create a small ghetto and you provide them with all kinds of services. Ironically, it never happened, for instance, to us. So there was a very high percentage of Azerbaijanis living in Armenia, which, by the way, have been all expelled by now, in the several waves, in the beginning 1920s and then 1948, when the Armenians were brought from outside by Stalin's decree to settle in current-day Armenia, and then, of course, in 1980s that I referred to earlier. So those people never got the same degree of autonomy. So it was not always fair, it was not universal, but I do think I do have a benefit of it. I want to give them a benefit of a doubt that they thought this would be a solution. That the Soviet approach generally saw this as something that could be used to promote ethnic identity, to support ethnic aspirations. Plus, if it serves the strategic interests of the Soviet Union, why not?
Do you think, what do you see as the future for that region? Do you think it's along a path to hopefully normalization of relations and a more peaceful understanding going forward? Do you think history will continue to repeat itself in that space?
You mean between Armenia and Azerbaijan? History, unfortunately, has a habit of repeating itself genuinely, though not in an exact pattern we think sometimes, but it's not linear. It's some spiral, let's put it that way. So we have two options. In 2020, Azerbaijan restored its territorial integrity within internationally recognized borders. We never left our borders. Now refugees can go back. The territories are devastated. It's just, one day you should go and see it. It's horrible. I've never seen a destruction like this. No stone is left on stone. And they're all heavily mined. So it takes us time. It takes us, people say, about 20 years to demine the place. You can rebuild and go, but if you go, for instance, to some of the places and they tell you just follow this path because everywhere else are mines, landmines, and people get blown up. About 300 people were just injured and killed just in the last couple of years.
Wow.
So rebuilding is a big process. Returning of the displaced communities is a big process, and for me it matters because I was a UNHCR officer in Azerbaijan. I worked with refugee communities, with displaced communities in Azerbaijan. So one option is to continue this ethnic thinking, when Armenians think, look, seeing everything through an ethnic prism, and say, look, we are ancient people, Armenians, we have this ethnic rights, we want to expand. Almost tribal. Or we look at the region and say, we all live here, and we need to find a way, in a way, Nash equilibrium, in which we could all prosper to the extent that doesn't infringe on other people's prosperity. I think We have, in a way, managed to do that with Turkey, for instance, and Georgia. Georgia, Azerbaijan, I think, is a very good example of cooperation. Increasingly, cooperation with the Turkic states in Central Asia and Central Asia in general, across the Caspian, cross-Caspian cooperation. I am hopeful because I think, I mean, Armenian people are our neighbors. We lived next to each other for centuries. We have had years of prosperity next to each other. There is no overwhelming reason for Armenia to remain this isolated state out of the regional puzzle and being basically unconnected part of basically the blank spot on the map. Why? They could become a part of regional cooperation. They could become a part of the regional communication systems. They could benefit from newly found ability, room for maneuver, which was all enabled, by the way, by the Azerbaijani restoration of territorial integrity. And that's why, despite all the pain, despite all the distraction, despite all the displacement, right after the war, despite Azerbaijan being the decisive victorious side, Azerbaijan has offered right away a peace agreement. We insist on peace agreement. We want to open borders. We want to build communications. We offered 5 principles of international law, such as respect, mutual respect for territorial integrity, non-use of force, things like opening a communication, establishing diplomatic relations. This is our initiatives, and we keep insisting on them. And much of the progress has been made. I mean, today you have, for the first time in history, we have direct talks between Azerbaijan and Armenia. As a result of these talks, Azerbaijan is now hosting COP29 because Armenia has endorsed Azerbaijani nomination. About 80% of the agreement, I think, is kind of elaborated by now. We have done a good work on delimitation, demarcation of the border. Yes, it's a small piece, but there's still more to develop. But the Commission is working. So in a way, I'm hopeful.
Azerbaijan sits, as we were talking about, at the intersection of the East and the West, and at the intersection of historically some of the greatest empires that the world's seen, from the Ottomans in the 16th century to the Romans, to the Huns, the Mongols, the Persian Safavid Empire. To what extent do you still feel that Azerbaijan continues to be at the intersection of great empires, but they've shifted slightly? It's now the Europeans, still the Iranians, Russians. Does that intersection still exist in the same way? Are there parallels with history?
Yes, but in a way it's different. It's no longer empires, I would say. It's not imperial intersection, but it says the gravity, the poles of gravity are still there, the centers of gravity around us. If I may touch on something, the area now part of what you said yourself first about Russia being a complex society, which is very complex. I lived in Russia, traveled there, so you could see how diverse the place is. First, an interesting part about Iran, you refer to Safavid Empire, but Safavid Empire, for instance, was established by the Turkic tribes, and Shah Ismail Hatari, the Safavid, the founder of the empire, was ethnic Azerbaijani, speaking Azerbaijani language and writing poetry in Azerbaijan. In fact, the foundation of the empire was Turkic-speaking Kızılbaş force, which were the committed.
That's another interesting point. Some of the greatest poets in Persian Iranian history are Azeri.
Yes, exactly. And if you look at this, so it was a Turco-Persian combination, which I think is important to understand. It's of course, Persian culture is fascinating and a beautiful culture, but the statehood in Iran for the longest time, in what we know as Iran now, versus be it Safavid Empire, be it Qajar Empire, or Afsharids, they were all ethnic Azerbaijanis or Turkic leaders. This is actually very interesting. The combination, and because the region is so complex that this combination of factors has its own impact on cultures. Yes, I think Azerbaijan is right at the center of all the whirlwinds around the region. One former U.S. ambassador in Azerbaijan used to say Azerbaijan is a keystone country for the region. I agree. Just look at the map. From the Arctic Circle to the tip of the Gulf, there are only three countries. Russia, the largest country in the world, landmass. Azerbaijan, 10 million plus people, and Iran. It goes from Asia to Europe, from Europe to Asia. Those are your options. And that's why the communication-wise, the middle corridor which goes to Azerbaijan, the connectivity to the Trans-Caspian connectivity is such an important part of regional, I would say, security, regional stability, and prosperity. So yes, we are in the middle of this. The question is, do you use it to your benefit? Do you build all those influences into a positive energy, or you become crushed by that? And I think creating and establishing regional alliances, working with your neighbors, building a stronger, resilient states, the way we try to do with Georgia and Central Asia, and hopefully one day with Armenia, is something that would make it a positive development. I mean, at the end of the day, with all the negativity that all the invasions and incursions and all the influences came throughout history, many of them brought some positive things too. So what do you do with that? Do you reject that? Do you confront that negatively, or you embrace who you are, you embrace your position geographically and build on it? I think that's part of what Azerbaijan is. That's why I refer to the first Azerbaijani Republic, the Azerbaijan Democratic Republic, being at the center of cultural influences and being so inclusive, because that's how you build success.
Do you see a more, I guess, maybe historically the nations of Azerbaijan and Iran haven't quite been as close? Do you see room for stronger ties in the future? They're both, your Azerbaijan and Iran are both majority Shia countries. I think the only two. What is the potential for?
I think they also, if I'm not mistaken, Iraq is majority Shia. I'm not.
You might be right in that. I'd have to check. And the other thing, just to mention, that I think is important, ethnically, there's a large population in Iran. I think around 15 million or so. Does that sound right?
Probably more.
Probably more. That is historically Azeri. Is that a good nexus for stronger ties in the future, or is it? I mean, it's a difficult balancing act with the West and with Iran.
It's a good question, because culturally, earlier I referred to, for instance, to the legacy of Safavid Empire or to the Qajar Empire. Both Qajars and Safavids and even Afsharids spoke Azerbaijani language. In fact, there's a monument to the founder of the Safavid Empire, Shah Ismail, in Baku, Azerbaijan, but not as a Shah, but rather as a poet, Azerbaijani poet, which is a very good one, by the way. But of course, the connection is very strong. I mean, many of our people have families on both sides of the river. There are many millions of ethnic Azerbaijanis living in Iran. I mean, current president of Iran, Masoud Pezeshkian, says that he's speaking Azerbaijani language at home. So the connection is very strong. Cultural connection is very strong. I mean, we have so much in common. We lived centuries next to each other. I don't see any question about the cultural closeness and being people with shared culture, shared history, shared similarities. Today, we're trying to build good neighborly relations with Iran. We have some different views on many issues, but those are political decisions made by each leadership in each country and people making their choices in each country. But culturally speaking, of course, there's so much in common. The difficulties you refer are geopolitical and political difficulties. Those are issues of current world affairs, and they're understandable. They'll come and go, and as we speak, there's a crisis in the region between Iran and Israel and other countries as well. But if we talk about the cultural constant between our nations, it's always been there. It will probably be there. We share so much, including food, which is important, I think. So I see.
I think food heals a lot of rift,
Yes,
doesn't it?
and a
You
good-
get
and a
around the
good food
dinner
feast.
table.
Similarly, by the way, probably, although we're more politically aligned and closest partnership with Turkey, our cultural relation with Turks is also very close. I mean, Azerbaijan is not just predominantly Shia, which I don't. It's difficult to say what is the percentage. Although we have both Shia and Sunni, and Azerbaijan is the only place, perhaps, in the world where Shia and Sunni pray in the same mosque, which is important because at the end of the day, we're all Muslims and we all have one God. I think everything else is secondary. But we're also a Turkic people, predominantly Turkic people. So that connection, strong connection which exists between Azerbaijan and Turkey, and mutual support, respect, and I would say almost a family relationship. We often say one nation, two states between Turkey and Azerbaijan. So I think that also is important. And I think they're not contradicting each other, they're complementary. I don't see a contradiction between having a long history of cultural relation with Iran and having the closest relationship with Turkey as possible.
The stewardship of these relationships in the region is something that has to be done with extreme care and is down to diplomats and also the president, President Aliyev of Azerbaijan. And he is someone who has been in post for a long time, for 20 years, and sometimes leaders that are in post for a little longer, certainly in the eyes of the West, some people might find criticism in that longevity. How should people in the West understand and look at leaders who have been in post for a longer period of time?
Thank you. Azerbaijan just had their presidential elections earlier this year. I know the West has its own views, and others may have, someone in the East may have their own views. But what is the most important is the view of the people of Azerbaijan. Azerbaijan is a sovereign nation. If the people of Azerbaijan choose this person, in this case President Aliyev, repeatedly and overwhelmingly to be their leader, it's our choice. Let's say. I mean, I'm also now I say as a citizen of Azerbaijan, not just as an ambassador. That's our choice. For me as a citizen as well. And let me ask you, if we put aside ideological and let's say small matters of perceptions, on the most fundamental issue is why not? Azerbaijan has prospered. The poverty is down from 49 to 5%. The stewardship you mentioned, in the most difficult and complicated part of the world, throughout the years when you have all kinds of challenges facing Azerbaijan, has been, I think, exemplary, thanks God. And the ability to build relationships with leaders who don't agree with each other, the restoration of Azerbaijan's territorial integrity. What other leader has delivered that to his own people? I, working as a UNHCR officer with displaced communities, I didn't know if I would ever dream about the time they would go back. But now I know those people I spoke to who lived in the tents before. And by the way, in the meantime, it was under leadership of the same President Aliyev that their conditions have been improved and they moved to temporary housing. Azerbaijan never left its people to stay in the camps for too long. The moment we get the ability to pay for it, we move them. But now these people are going back. I know them. They go back to their villages, to their homes, to the places they come from. Why shouldn't these people support a leader who gave them that ability. When Azerbaijan became independent in 1991, on the day of our independence, Azerbaijan's territorial integrity was compromised. Azerbaijan was born into the United Nations, as an independent nation, already as a wounded nation, because our territory was occupied, our people were being expelled. There was a pain. And that pain resonated for 3 decades throughout every single Azerbaijani I know. For me, because I was on the streets myself since early days of the conflict, I know this. And it's not just generic political pain, it's personal for everybody, because every single one of us was hurt. For instance, in my summers, my father would take me to the mountains of Kalbajar, the most beautiful region in Azerbaijan. Amazing. It's like combination of Switzerland and Grand Canyon. I wrote an article in a US paper saying, look, this is our Grand Canyon. And when I tried to explain to Americans what the loss of Karabakh meant to us, I said to them, imagine if one day Americans lose Grand Canyon. Can you live with that? Wouldn't you feel it personally? And he delivered to all of us. He delivered the return of our people. He delivered my dream of being able to go back to my father's place in Kelbajar. He gave every and each of us ability to feel personally gratified. And that, of course, was done under his leadership by the people of Azerbaijan. It was our military, but also by the people, by the nation. So people of Azerbaijan do feel, I'm very confident, that this is the leadership they want and they support. So if we speak about sovereignty, if we speak about the people's choice, if we speak about democracy, doesn't that mean that people have a right to choose their leader? And there's never been a question that people overwhelmingly support President Ilham Aliyev. So I think that's how everybody should see it. I mean, it's a sovereign choice of our people.
His father, Heydar Aliyev, is regarded by many as the father of modern Azerbaijan. How does his son, the current President Aliyev, how does his leadership differ from his father's?
His father saved Azerbaijan at a very difficult moment. His presidency came at a very difficult time. By 1994, we had to sign, there were coup attempts. In 1994, we had to sign a ceasefire agreement in which, once again, 20% of Azerbaijan was occupied. What his father has done was to establish the basis and protect independence of Azerbaijan at the most difficult moment. By the way, he signed an agreement, a very creative agreement in terms of production sharing agreements with Western oil companies, including, by the way, mostly BP, which brought prosperity to the region. And his foundational thinking included a number of things. One, Azerbaijan must become a rapidly developing, prosperous nation. There must be peace in the region. Azerbaijan cannot prosper if the region doesn't prosper. So that's why he worked very closely with Georgians and Turks, Russians and others to bring the region together and to, let's say, to expand the pie of stability and prosperity. And he has managed that. Heydar Aliyev you could almost see that in his speeches. He would always say, our independence is the highest value we have. It's the greatest treasure for us is our independence. And you could see that this is a leader of he is a foundational person in Azerbaijani statehood. What Ilham Aliyev has done is take that foundation and develop Azerbaijan much further in terms of economic growth, in bringing the world together. So building on that foundation, a new, beautiful, and modern building, a more reformed society, a more open society, a more confident society, a society which for instance, is able, the country which can lead the non-alignment movement of 120 very divergent nations. Azerbaijan could do that under the leadership of Ilham Aliyev. And think about this, they don't agree with each other, this 120 nations, the second largest grouping after UN, but they all agreed that Azerbaijan should extend its leadership for another year, so 4 years, not 3. Then, of course, you have a nation which has become a host for Formula One, the most watched race on the calendar.
Baku Grand Prix,
yes, we're
the
hosting,
highlight.
Yeah, we're hosting Islamic games. We host the European games. We host football matches. We'll host COP. That is all the result of a policy of President Ilham Aliyev opening to the world. And then most importantly, he delivered on his father's promise to restore the territory of our nation to its international borders. I still remember Heydar Aliyev speaking to the displaced communities, and he would tell them, I have no doubt you will go back to your homes. And everybody said, well, is it possible? People had doubts. And his son said, yes, it is possible. He made it happen. So I think we have a continuity of leadership, but also a different style of leadership, a more modern, more worldly person. But also, the world has changed. It is no longer post-Soviet space, in a way. It's a different. It's a different geography now, and I think from a geographic point of view, going back to what you mentioned about geography, it's very interesting to watch. It's difficult to understand the region without knowing geography, and I'm very happy to say that in the United Kingdom you see better understanding of how the world looks than in many other places.
What sort of a person is President Aliyev? Behind the scenes, what does he like to interact with? What does he value?
He's a very straightforward person. One of the things, a person who is very committed to his principles. That may irritate some. That may, may make some feel, look, why is he, sticking to this position? But he never changes his principles. And the principles are to be straightforward and honest. And most importantly, serve the people of Azerbaijan, and putting Azerbaijan as the number one priority. It's not always easy. It's not always easy because people say, maybe you could compromise there, maybe you could compromise here. But once you begin doing that, then there's a slippery slope. And at some point, you lose sight of bigger things. And I think he's always knew that what the focus is. And the focus is Azerbaijan's prosperity and security. He's also two things which people kind of feel, but they don't fully realize. First of all, he's a very kind person. That's why you could see this in his interaction with people. He's a very people's man. He likes to be with people. People like being with the president. I'll give you one example. Every birthday he has, 24th of December, he used to spend with the displaced families. He would always go to the house. And
I think other leaders should take a page out of that.
Maybe he would always go, and they would say happy birthday and all this, and he said the best birthday for me would be to see you go home. And he delivered on that. Now he goes to the families of those people who either suffered or the martyrs, the people who were lost during the war. He goes to their homes and sits with their families and says, look, this is my birthday, I want to spend with you. You lost someone, I want to be with you this day. So that is an important factor. So I see the connection with people. And the other thing, which is also very interesting, and he's very convincing when you talk to him. And I think that is the testimony of every foreign leader who spoke to him. Because he speaks very clearly and in a way very simply and truthfully, then actually it works quite well. Where people hear him, and he is very convincing because of that. So I think we're very lucky to have a president like him, and I think he leads our nation to a right path, and also, the most importantly, I think the region as a whole. He has earned his trust, among others, among fellow leaders, among other nations. Of course, that people in Azerbaijan respect Ilham Aliyev, and I mean that we talked about this. But I often go to talk to our neighbors, to our friends around the world, and they do too. People around the world in the NAM countries, non-alignment movements, leaders, for instance, from some Commonwealth nations who came to Azerbaijan, met with him, for instance, small island states leaders. They were all impressed. Well, they all talked to me about his kindness. I recently spoke to a very senior diplomat from Nigeria. And look, it's true, I'm not making it up. This is real. And there was a moment when he served in Azerbaijan, not as ambassador, but not in Azerbaijan. He was posted to Azerbaijan, but served elsewhere. He was a non-resident posting. And I said, how do you like Baku and all this? And he said, it's a beautiful city, of course. And then he said, he said, what I remember the most is the kindness of your president. Wow. And I said, really? How? Tell me more. And he says, when I was not an ambassador. I was a, mid-ranking officer. We were at a meeting, and I was standing, he said, aside, and the president looked around, saw me, and said, "Come, sit next to me. Come here." Spoke to me and all that. He never ignored me, despite me not being the highest-ranking guest and all that. So, which was it was a very pleasant surprise. It was random for me to hear from someone, I didn't even know had met my president. And same goes for our neighbors. I mean, he has enjoyed strong support and respect in Georgia. I think in Turkey, in Russia, in Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, we're very grateful for that. We're all grateful to all people who appreciate his leadership. And I think, the most important thing, here, all those qualities, I do hope, appreciated by people of Armenia as well. And I hope they understand and that under his leadership, we can work together to build a peaceful region, and which will bring benefits of peace and dividends of peace to them as well. Because our goal is not to harm Armenia in any way. We have no territorial claims, nothing. What we want is to have a lasting peace, to have a solid foundation on a basis of agreement, which is irreversible and unbreakable, for solid peace, and then working together for the future.
What would either an ally or a foreign adversary have to do in order to gain the president's respect?
Respect Azerbaijan's sovereignty and independent decision-making, and treat us as equal. If we're treated as equal partners, you make one step towards us, Azerbaijan under the leadership of President Aliyev will make 10 steps towards you. Treating Azerbaijan as a sovereign, independent nation with respect, on mutual respect, is the key.
And what lessons from the part of the world that you spend time in, that you're from, could benefit people here in order to bring people together?
I think we spoke about world being not black and white. That simple stereotypes and definitions don't work. For instance, Azerbaijan is a home to one of the oldest Jewish communities in the world. 2,500 years old Jewish community lives in Azerbaijan, safe and sound. And the only Jewish town outside is a fully Jewish town, is in Azerbaijan. We have Christian citizens. We've never discriminated. And we have different denominations of Muslims. I said Shia and Sunni pray together. So no single person is just a member of a group. We're all individual. We all have unique feelings. So I get very saddened when I see this, mutual accusations, sometimes racist, sometimes xenophobic. And on the receiving side, we often see completely unfounded and very ignorant accusations which are based on Islamophobia in a way. And I think the world today faces two twin evils: Islamophobia and anti-Semitism, and they're actually kind of two sides of the same medal. I think we have to be very careful with those, and in general, judging people by their identity, not by their action, is a dangerous thing. UK actually is a very good example of an inclusive society which has managed to do good things. But I want to see that more. Some recent events have made me nervous here, made me worried about that cohesion, that unity, whether it can actually, how well it will go into the future, because the easiest thing is to break things. It's much more difficult to heal and build. I think what is important for all of us is to remember that we do come all from the same creator. We're all the same people. Yes, people have different opinions and all this, but the God himself tells us, I created you different so you go and know each other. That's the whole point of living this life. So I think this is important to avoid these things, to avoid these discriminatory labels, and to, instead of letting people be who they are, trying to capitalize on this towards your own quite short-term political gains. And it goes for in all directions. I mean, this is not one direction. But I think if you think about Azerbaijan as a country being so inclusive, so internationally cooperative with everybody, including Israel and, let's say, what they call the Christian countries and all, and being sometimes accused by some of Islamophobia, of being an Islamist or something. This is so out of context and so in a way racist that it's an easy bait, but I don't think we should fall for that. I think that's important to avoid those kind of things, because it would be, if someone would tell me, whether the Jews or Christians, the first thing you say, well, people are people. They're not all Jews are the same.
People forget that as well, though, a lot.
Not all Christians are the same.
Yeah.
Why do people think that all Muslims are the same? I mean, if for the same person who accuses you of you're an Islamist, and you say, "Are you a crusader?" He said, "Why? Why would you call me?" I said, "Well, you just did it yourself towards someone else." So I think it's an important element of our global conversation today, not to fall into these pitfalls of division.
That sounds very constructive.
I hope so.
Another part of the history, the story of Azerbaijan starting in the 19th century, and part of the research for this interview, I didn't realize how important the oil industry was, not just internally but globally. The first oil well was dug in Azerbaijan in 1846, I think it was.
That's a good thing. When I was in the United States, I had to be careful.
Oh yes, because there was a bit of rivalry.
Because my good friends in Pennsylvania, the beautiful state, by the way.
Yes.
Swing state of all.
Yeah.
They insist that it was dug in, the first oil well was dug in 1856, sorry, in Pennsylvania. We of course know that it was dug in Azerbaijan, but
well, I think
about 8 years earlier. So.
The specifics of that is that I believe the one in the States, people often claim was the first oil well because it was drilled by machine. But I think using manual means, the one in Azerbaijan was drilled. So the one in Azerbaijan, was the first one. It was the first one drilled. Then the other thing that I found really interesting was that Azerbaijan actually played a huge part through its oil industry in the Second World War. From 1941 to 45, I think it produced 63% of the Soviet Union's oil reserves and contributed 200,000-300,000 troops to help beat the Nazis. So what's apparent is the underlying value globally not just internally, but globally, of the oil industry in Azerbaijan, oil and gas, now gas. This is something that's continued to maintain its relevance well into the 21st century. And now oil and gas are a big subject of discussion in terms of energy security. How do you view those two resources, oil and gas, as a strategic geopolitical tool in modern economics and on the modern geopolitical battlefield, I guess?
I think we need to begin with two premises. One, fundamentally, we have learned that energy security is national security. It's very simple. If you don't have energy security, you're dependent on the most fundamental factor, and you're most vulnerable in terms of national security because you don't have either diversity of supply or your own production. In whatever way you ensure your energy security, and it becomes fundamental. The other thing we should also remember, as you said, history of Baku and Azerbaijan and oil are inseparable. The first oil boom of the 20th century began in Azerbaijan, began in Baku. By 1910, Baku was producing 50% of global oil supply. It is probably about the same amount which was used to heat our tea,
Yes.
but relatively speaking, you could say that. But it has a global implication, as you say. There was the first pipeline was built to Georgia, then the tankers. The first tanker, I think, was called Zoroaster, and then you had Baku became this cosmopolitan center with beautiful architecture from Europe, and also because people would come and invest. You have nobles, you have Rothschilds, Rockefellers, all the world coming together in Baku to develop oil. And by the way, Baku oil was a very high quality, it's a very low sulfur oil, it's very light. It's by the way one of the five least polluting oils in the world. So I mean that's also important to understand for our friends to deal with the environment. The couple of things you mentioned are very important. I think for the Bolshevik Revolution, Baku played a significant role in two things. One is, of course, supply of fuel. The other one is because of the oil work. Because of the oil field, there was a lot of workers and proletariat. It was there. So that's why Stalin, for instance, operated in Baku, because that's why there were so many Bolsheviks among the oil workers as well, working to make sure that they had created enough bases.
It was incredibly strategically important for the Soviet Union.
In fact, Joseph Stalin was arrested in Baku and was the only prisoner who ever escaped at the Bail prison in Azerbaijan. The prison is no longer there. Building of BP is there, which is kind of symbolic.
Oh, interesting.
But if you think about this one prisoner you don't want to let go, it's probably...
No, I know.
You're also right about World War II. There was actually a very famous real video of Adolf Hitler at his in some bunker being given a birthday cake, and they gave him the cake with a map of Europe and Asia and said, "Cut your favorite piece," and he cuts Baku.
Oh, really?
It makes you very uncomfortable. There was an order for the Germans to actually take Baku, and they didn't want to bomb the oil fields because they wanted to own them. And there was actually a very interesting story about this in Azerbaijan as well. Is just outside Baku. You know, Azerbaijan's poetic name is the land of fire. It also refers to the Zoroastrian heritage of Azerbaijan. And there was this place which is called the Burning Mountain, where the gas comes out naturally for centuries. I mean, if you're an ancient man, you're not Zoroastrian, let's say, but you come there in the middle of the night and you see the Burning Mountain. I don't want to compare to the burning bush in the Bible, but you kind of think that's a manifestation of the Almighty. You know, that's for our limited mind, that's probably how it will look. It's a beautiful place you should visit. In the Soviet times, because I was a marker, they put concrete slabs over it, so the German fighter jets would not see it.
Oh, wow.
The problem was that it came from the other side. You can't keep the fire of Azerbaijani gas. So if anybody doubts about our gas, they should go there. Azerbaijan did provide most of the Soviet military's fuel during World War II, and I think about 600,000 Azerbaijanis fought in the war, including many heroes. I mean, there was, for instance, a very famous tank commander, Heydar Aliyev, who was a hero of the Soviet Union, who was from Azerbaijan. But there was also a very famous photo of a Soviet, which is not something that's why we talk about complexities of life. A Soviet division in a Soviet uniform, in the snow, going to an offensive in 1944 against Nazi forces. And all the Soviets, and about 90% of that division was ethnically Azerbaijani. And they are praying a Muslim namaz. They're making a Muslim prayer before the fight. Can you imagine Soviet communist army led by a completely Soviet uniform general who's also Azerbaijani? And all the soldiers standing there, and they're on their knees praying in the snow.
That's something the movies don't feature, you know?
We have to understand that. The life is not black and white. Life is much more interesting. It's much more colorful than that. And so Azerbaijan provided oil and gas and oil to the Russian tanks, for instance, Soviet tanks. And because our oil is so easy to refine, it didn't take much refination. That's why it was easier to take it, to put it in a tank, and basically, you remember the Kursk battle of 1943, when the Soviets decisively defeated the German military. Tank battle. And why? It was the largest tank battle in history. Why? I think Germans lacked two things which Russians, the Soviets, I keep referring to the Soviets had,
yes,
because we all fought there. I mean, to be honest, we have to understand that every part of the Soviet Union participated. Georgia, Central Asia, Ukraine, everybody fought. So what the Soviets had was aluminum and a light oil, which enabled tanks to be lighter and move faster. Germans did not have enough supply of oil. That's why they tried to get to Azerbaijan, and they did not have aluminum. That's why they went as far as Argentina, remember, to try to find it, because that the heavy armor on the tanks make them less
maneuverable. Yeah,
that's how they lost the battle. So Azerbaijan's role in this is actually fundamental. Unfortunately, I have to say something else, that the allies, including our good friends here in Britain, actually had a plan to bomb Baku if Germans would take over, simply not to allow. That's also, people don't talk much about it. It's kind of sad, to be honest.
Yeah.
And once again, you think about this, great powers are fighting each other, and they bomb you, you're like, really? Is that? I mean, it's so, that's why we value the independence. We value stability, and I think that's important. And by now, I mean, since Azerbaijan became independent, Azerbaijan became the major contributor to European energy security, to oil, Baku-Tbilisi-Ceyhan pipeline, and now to the Southern Gas Corridor, the single most important pipeline delivered gas project, the longest in the world, by the way, to the European markets. And we provide to the Europeans, and the Europeans ask now as well.
That's shouldering a lot of the deficit as a result of the lack of purchasing of oil and gas from Russia now.
Yeah, we can't replace Russia, of course, if volumes are not there. But we can contribute to energy security, and especially in the Balkans, and also, so now that's what's happening.
Coming up in November, there is the COP29, UN COP29 summit. This is something that's being hosted in Baku, and it is incredibly progressive for an economy built on oil and gas, petrochemicals, to be so forward-looking in terms of the climate. How are you looking to leverage the perhaps spotlight, the recognition, the investment of the COP29 summit, both for Azerbaijan but also for the broader fight against climate change?
Thank you. I think I don't want to divide nations in fossil producing and non-fossil producing. First of all, many of us do not realize that everybody is a fossil.
Do you think of yourself as an oil producing?
Yeah, because Baku, because my town
Okay.
is so, my birthplace is so
Yes.
connected to oil. But if you live, for instance, in a different part of Azerbaijan, in the mountains, you think about yourself as a great mountain man.
So it's not as big a part of the national identity as perhaps outsiders would be led to believe.
Yeah, of course.
Okay.
And the other thing is that think about this. COP26 happened here, and it was a very important meeting in Scotland, in Glasgow. I mean, that is UK is a major fossil fuel producing country.
Well, I think in the last couple of weeks, the last coal plant shut down, and the British Empire was built on the Industrial Revolution, which was built on coal.
So let's be fair to each other, and think about solutions, not about things like this. First of all, as I said, the beginning of the oil revolution and age began in Azerbaijan. Maybe this will be a turning point in beginning the green energy transition, maybe in Azerbaijan as well. We do invest. Our major investments are in a hydro, in wind, and in solar. And look who is investing. Aqua from Saudi Arabia, a fossil producing country. Masdar from UAE, fossil producing country. And BP, which yesterday signed an agreement on investing into the
a solar project?
A solar project, a major one, 240 megawatts in a liberated territory.
That was yesterday?
Yesterday.
Ah, that's really, I saw an article from 2021 where they were making the commitment. They said they would make the commitment to do that. So that's actually been...
So they're moving forward.
Wow, that's progress.
I think the bigger announcement will be made during the COP itself. Then, of course, all the liberated territories, which is the size of, I mean, this is unfortunately quite timely comparison to 4 Lebanons, size of 4 Lebanon, will also be completely net zero. So we're looking at this. That's why everything is done. There is a smart villages, net zero development, green investment there, and we're building a cable, which would go electricity cable, which will go from Azerbaijan to Georgia under the Black Sea into Romania and Hungary, for providing green electricity to Europe. So we're doing all those things. Fundamentally, COP will be focused on financing. If all of us, the world, reach what we call the new collective quantitative goal, NCQG, yes, then we move forward with the climate action. So far, there are many pronouncements, but there's a justified fatigue and kind of lowering of trust towards the commitments made in Paris, because there have not been resources matching that commitment. So in Azerbaijan, the global community is facing a challenge of matching those statements, those ambitions, with actual resources. That's, I think, the most important thing in Azerbaijan. So we were looking for that. I think that's fundamental. We don't try to leverage it for ourselves. We want to enable a conversation, inclusive conversation, what you call it north, call it south, call it west, east, doesn't matter, without blaming anybody, but coming together for a solution. It's easy to blame people, but I think we need to look for what could be done because it's our global problem. One thing, for instance, we're doing as well, we signed a memorandum, MOU, with the Commonwealth of Nations to bring in leadership of SEEDs, small island development states. They facing the most urgent issue of flooding and rising water levels. So addressing those issues and challenges, I think, is very urgent. And what often happens is people talk about these nations without giving them a seat at the table. What we want to do that everybody is involved.
That's something I think Azerbaijan has made tangible, both commitments and investments, to the tune of a few $100 million, if I'm correct, in some of these smaller nations to help them deal with the climate issues that they face.
Yes, exactly. And we will do more. And we'll also, there are a number of initiatives, there are 14 initiatives for COP29. And one of them is, for instance, to establish a fund annual, which will be only for the fossil fuel producing nations to contribute specifically.
So this is a broader with a number of countries.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. And it will be annual. So every year you have to replenish it, and specifically to address the mitigation issues and other research issues. So I think we're trying to do what we can, but also, of course, it doesn't depend on us alone. Azerbaijan is a country of 10 million people. We could be enabled the way we were at the non-alignment movement. But it's a collective decision making including by major global powers.
I believe in the FT, the commitment that Azerbaijan made, funded in part by SOCAR, was around 500 million just to start with,
yes,
to be put towards green initiatives. Do you hope that some of the Western institutional investors, and not just the oil companies, with their ESG agendas come in and join that, and that COP29 enables some of that investment?
We really truly hope to see that, and we work with MDBs quite a lot, and all kinds of international organizations. I think that it's a joint effort to make sure that we move forward with but what it needs to do, it needs to address the real challenges which people face. I mean, it should not be just a declarative conversation. Don't forget, even with COP happening next month, Azerbaijan was given the least time of anybody. The decision was made on December 11th of 2023, last year. So we had less than a year. Nobody has less than a year. We had to prepare for COP. Imagine the steep learning curve and all this. And sleepless nights of our COP presidency members flying around the world trying to enable the conversation. The other first initiative, which is very important for us, is a COP Truth. It's very similar to the Olympic Truth. Every 4 years, during the Olympics, the United Nations calls on a tradition in the Greek mythology for Olympic Truth, ceasefire. And we want to see, we made a similar appeal, ask everybody to join it. And we get criticized for it, saying it's hypocritical and all this. What is hypocritical about asking people to cease fire? Some say, oh, nobody's going to listen to me. Maybe, but it's still worth trying. And if anywhere one conflict, even a small one, stops for 10 days, let's say, and 150 lives are saved, is it not worth an appeal? I think people get so overwhelmed with the stereotypes and ideological thinking and divisive rhetoric that they forget that at the root of this is appeal for peace. It doesn't matter who makes that appeal. It doesn't matter if it's universally accepted. What matters is that can it save something? Can it do something? And the Bible says, "Blessed are the peacemakers." So anybody who can join that appeal could become part of that blessing, hopefully. We'll see. I mean, I don't know if it works or not, but we're trying very hard to make sure that people heed it.
What do you hope the legacy of COP29 will be, but also more broadly the legacy of your president, who is aiming to at some point transition the country to a more sustainable energy future?
I think that the practical legacy globally, and that is that we would finally enable the action, and we would move from declarations into focused, practical, deliverable.
Talking to doing, right?
To doing. That's important. I think if that becomes a success, inshallah, then what we get is a functionality which is important, because it will address the most important challenge we have today globally. The other thing which would also happen is that our region will become much more aware of the issue of climate change. I mean, the Caspian Sea levels are falling. It's a major environmental challenge for all of our nations in the Caspian region. It's not only our COP, it's COP for our neighbors as well, for Central Asia, for Georgia, for Armenia, for everybody. I mean, that's why Armenians endorsed it. So I think the heightened awareness of our common challenges, an important legacy of COP for our region as a whole, because it's the first time COP is held in our region. So that's important to remember. And for, I think, two things which will matter for Azerbaijan and for President Aliyev personally. One is that this, we believe, would give a strong impetus for moving Azerbaijan more towards green energy economy, because that's how we want to see our country. Azerbaijan is a beautiful country. It's a mountain. We have 9 out of 11 possible climatic zones, from subtropics to alpines. In a very small country, we're jammed into this small geography. We need to protect it. If we can work more intensively on promoting green energy, alternative energy supplies, then perhaps that would become a legacy which will help our people to live both in a more prosperous society, but also in a more, let's say, is a cleaner, greener society. That's why President Aliyev declared this year the year of green solidarity. And that's for Azerbaijan this year is under the slogan of green solidarity, which I think is important. The second thing I think which is also important, both for Azerbaijan, for the region, and I think for President Aliyev as a leader, that we move beyond all these chapters of hostilities. We're no longer a small inward-looking region, that we talk about something which is far beyond one single country's abilities or interests. Talk about our global challenges. We bring the world to our region, and we take our region to the world. So I think that new elevated level of discourse in our nation and in our region, I think, is something that is an important legacy for both Azerbaijan and President Aliyev.
That sounds like a very positive legacy, Your Excellency.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you very much.